life. Okay. Please let me know if you can all hear me.
Yes, you're audible, Miss Tamina, and we are like,
Okay. Thank you so much, my dear Kanvi. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tahmina Dowari, and I'm the Executive Assistant at the Women Ascension and Entrepreneur Ecola. I am very happy to moderate today's session with all of you. Now, before we start, I want to share a little about Women Ascension. Women Ascension is a global movement that believes women can change communities and the world. We are in 134 countries and we have 10 departments in areas like STEAM, climate, work, peace building, media, and more. Our 1 Million Leadership Program 2030 aims to teach and support 1 million women and youth to become strong, kind, and confident leaders. Here we learn, grow, and help each other. Our topic today is designing women lead climate initiative from awareness to action. This means we will learn how women can create climate projects that help their communities. We will talk about how women can understand climate problems and then take real steps to protect the environment. Simple action can make a big change. Now, today we are very lucky to have our speaker, Ms. Meso. Ms. Meso is a climate security researcher and social impact leader. She works as the executive director of the East Eco Africa Foundation in Kenya. She leads women-driven land and food projects that help dry areas become green again. Her work supports women farmers to grow food, rebuild land, and create safer and stronger communities. She also focuses on how climate problems can cause conflict and how can we prevent that. Now, with respect, I now invite Ms. Meso to take the floor and lead today's session. Ms. Meso, thank you so much for joining in. Now the floors are yours.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Maureen Meso. Um, as said earlier by Tahmina, I am a climate security researcher, and I also run a social enterprise called Eco Foundation. And our role is primarily to regenerate dry lands by supporting women through drought-resistant farming and value addition. So I will go straight to what we'll be discussing today. And I'm using the questions that were raised to guide the conversation. So walk with me. So what we will be talking about today is on how to design women-led climate initiatives from awareness to action. And we will be tackling four key areas. One is on understanding the essential role of women as climate leaders. The second one is on exploring how climate change affects women differently and why gender responsive climate action is crucial for sustainable solutions. We'll also be touching on how to design community-based climate initiatives. And then we'll finally talk about the practical approaches for climate education and how to build local resilience and green innovation in community programs. So to start off, I would like to just, this is information that is known to many, but we'll probably start by touching onto it. And we'll start by understanding what are the most common effects of climate change that we're experiencing globally. So to many of us, we understand climate change by issues on, say, drought and famine, issues on flooding, issues on rising sea levels, issues on increased health issues caused by heat waves, issues on food and water scarcity, and also the change of our ecosystem and biodiversity. And this could look like, say, the loss of specific species, or maybe the destruction of habitats caused by wildlife. So that is ideally the effects that we experience through climate change. And to get right into it, we are focusing on now how these effects influence women, how they affect them, and how women come out as frontliners in addressing some of these challenges, and how important it is to develop gender-responsive policies and mechanisms that protect women in events of climate change. There is a terminology known as the feminization of poverty. I do not know how many of us have come across this terminology. I recently came across it, and it's actually a very interesting thing. So when I was doing my research, I found out that the feminization of poverty is ideally how poverty affects women more compared to men. And by this, we are looking at the margins on women being more affected by poverty in terms of their loss of livelihoods, displacement, health issues, their lack of inclusivity with regards to decision making. And there are so many other integral parts that are supporting the feminization of poverty. And so to get right into it, our discussion centered on women, we'll start by asking ourselves these questions. So how then are women affected by climate change? In our own local level, in our own individual levels, how do you think women are affected by climate change? And I will start by telling you this. In Kenya, or where I'm coming from, or Africa as large, and based on research also Asia, we realize that women cover quite a big demographic with regards to food production. And by food production, we can go to as simple a level as providing food to their households. And by this we mean women are responsible to feeding their families. Women are the ones who champion in subsistence farming. Women are the ones that make decisions. What are we going to eat today? Is it a balanced diet? Do we have clean water to drink? Do we have clean water to cook with? So these decisions are left on women to make in most communities across the world. And so when we start off by establishing that, then now we can roll out to understand how this is tied to climate change. So we said that climate change is experienced in several things. Let us start by tackling agriculture. So 71% of the workforce in agriculture is covered by women. And by this, we are covering production, we are covering distribution, even consumption and waste management. So women are the ones that do a lot of farming on land. And of course, based on data, this information will be a bit relative because on subsistence farming, women are the ones who are responsible. But in commercial farming, then we will see men taking more outward approaches. But now most of the farming that we experience, or most of the farming that are done in our local levels are subsistence farming. And so women are the ones who are in charge of farming their land. They're in charge of taking care of the crops as they grow, watering the crops, harvesting the crops, processing the crops, and transforming them into food and placing them on our tables to eat. And also after that, they're the ones who need to figure out where we're going to trash these wasted tomatoes, where we're going to trash these bones from chicken. And so this entire process is spearheaded by women. So when climate change hits a community that is very dependent on agriculture, what happens is the first people to be affected the most will be women, because now they'll have to worry where are we going to get our food next. So we used to harvest 20 bags of maize. We're only harvesting 5 bags of maize. 15 bags from the 20 bags were for commercial use, used to sell them, and we generate income, and then we channel them to our households. But now we're only harvesting 5. So are we going to sell 3 and eat 2? So then that is food insecurity, right? So when climate change hits, this is how women are affected. And that is one example. The second example is in our local communities where I've grown up, women were responsible of taking care of water provisions in the family. So from where we're going to drink water, what water is used to cook, what water is used to bathe and clean our clothes, women were responsible. So how this will affect a woman is that when there is climate change, when there is drought, then that means there'll be more informal labor forced on these women because the wells are drying up, so they'll need to move longer distance to look for water to drink and water to cook with. And so that is another way that climate change affects women. Another example is on displacement and floods. So I was introduced earlier by Tahmina, yes, I am a researcher on climate security issues. And while I was doing my research, like I said in our first session, we had a first session and this is a follow-up session. So when I was doing my research on our first session, I realized that the communities that are affected by flooding the most and displacement but women end up being the most vulnerable of them. And by this, I mean, in a community where there is flood and houses have been destroyed and we have to move, we need to relocate. The first people that are affected are women. And I'll give you an example why this is actually another effects of climate change for women. So one, in some communities, women will never be allowed to leave their family behind. They need to carry their children, they need to carry their elderly, they need to carry the persons with disability living amongst them. That is their responsibility. So that is one. Two, in some communities, women are not even allowed to evacuate without their male relatives' permissions. So they need to wait there for their male relatives to come and allow them to leave and relocate to a place that is safer for them and their children. Another reason is that women were never trained, or some communities do not allow women to participate in activities because they consider it not women-like. You will find a community that does not allow women to climb trees, or that did not teach their women how to swim because those are activities done by men. So in an event where there is floods, then a woman cannot swim to save her life, a woman cannot climb a tree to save her life. And so then what happens when floods come, most of them end up dying and most of them end up experiencing the brunt effects of now the floods. And then finally, when something like drought happens, so then it's hard for women to recover out of it because they don't have the ability to prepare for a disaster or recover afterwards. In most communities from where I come from, issues that are affecting the community at large scale are mostly discussed by men in closed-off meetings. So women are never involved in these meetings. And what that means is when they're making decisions on then how can we get early warnings to some of these disasters, most women don't even know. Most of these discussions are done in closed doors. And so when a disaster happens, in an event of not even floods only, in an event of maybe disease outbreak, or in an event of maybe famine, most women are never involved in this discussion. So it's hard for them to even adjust or even adapt to it. But what is even more interesting is that regardless of women being involved in some of these discussions, they end up coming up with the best resilience mechanisms that protect them and their households and the community as large. That is another point on how women are affected by climate change. Another way that women are affected by climate change is that most informal sector jobs that we have in our communities are done by women. Say small-scale fishing, or say harvesting, or say packaging. Most of these are done by women. And unfortunately, often at times, because maybe due to unemployment issues, or maybe due to maybe them not being allowed to do jobs that are corporate related. And so when a disaster like climate change hits, then these women are the ones that are affected the most, because then if their work is in the informal sector and they're dependent on infrastructures, when it is affected by climate-induced disasters, then that means that they lose their sources of income and they end up more poorer, and hence the terminology feminization of poverty. So then once we've established how women are affected the most by climate change, maybe we can get into then how then women are coming up in large numbers to address climate change. And in most cases, some of these efforts made by women are not always very, very appreciated or regarded, because most of them are done in the household level, most of them are done in the local level. And like we were talking the other time, in the other session, and we discussed about how important it is to come up with projects and ideas that are addressing the grassroots challenges that are caused by climate change. Most people are focused and are hell-bent on global climate action issues. Most of them want to attend conferences. Most of them want to participate in talks. Which is actually very, very important. It's actually very, very relevant. But then again, we end up not recognizing efforts that are done by people at the grassroots levels that support those people that are doing amazing work on climate action in national and regional and international levels. And so I am going to take us now through how women are championing in the how women are taking charge in addressing climate change in their communities. So I'll start by this. I thought this was a challenge experienced only in Kenya because when I was doing my research, for the longest we always knew that women do not hold land rights where we come from, and in our tradition, land is owned by the man, and so if a woman is working on a piece of land, then that means the man has given them authority to work on that piece of land, but that does not mean that that woman owns that land, right? Another thing is because most of our women population are in the informal sector, especially from the rural area, it's hard for these women to equally get credits to support their economic empowerment initiatives like agriculture, processing, and anything that women do with regards to their economic empowerment. It's hard for them to get credit for it. And so when I established that this is something that happens often in our communities, I also came across this as a challenging issue because it cuts across other communities across the world. Women are not allowed the rights to own land. Women are not allowed the opportunities to credit or even extension services. And even though this is regarded as something that pulls women behind and that affects them with regards to them setting up opportunities for their own development and their growth, we see women come out in the front lines and in championing for early warning mechanisms for climate resilience in the same communities that are not regarded, they are not regarded and they're not granted rights to. And I will now walk us through what women are doing in the front lines and how that is positioning them and how important it is for now the communities to consider putting women in more frontline decision-making opportunities and also to like give them rights and opportunities to address this climate change. Because we're going to be honest, climate change is not gender neutral. Climate change is not gender neutral. Climate change affects one gender more than the other. And this is an opinion to myself, right? But I feel like based on what I've just explained, the the argument to how climate change will affect a man, a woman, and a kid is very, very different. And being that we've established that climate change is not gender neutral, then how is women being in the front line a very important thing to consider in coming up with gender responsive mechanisms and policies to protect them? And so I'll get straight into it. One, in our community levels, women are the ones that detect environmental change the first. Why? Because, like I said, they work the land, they fetch the water, they care for their households, and therefore they're the ones who will spot the first reduction in yields. They'll be the first ones to realize that specific rivers are drying up. They're the ones who will tell you when there's inconsistent rainfall seasons, right? So, what women are doing in our communities right now across the world is that we see women own their own seed banks. We see women run their own cooperative and self-help groups. And we see women coming up with interesting water harvesting ideas and alternative livelihoods to protect themselves from the brunt effects of climate change. So does that not make women frontliners in the fight against climate change? Because being the first detectors to an advantage that gives them an opportunity to think fast and come up with solutions. Two, how are women being the frontliners in climate change? Yes, we said that women are the largest demographic globally that work at the agricultural workforce. There are even studies that show this. There's a study with the UN and there's also a study by IPCC, and they say that gender responsive adaptations improve the outcome of climate change, which are often gendered impacts. Their impacts are very gendered. So gender responsive adaptation, according to the UN and the IPCC, thinks that they think that this improves outcomes of climate change. And also, despite the fact that women are underrepresented in leadership, them as frontliners, we see women taking up positions for themselves. In the past, when they were holding COPs across the world to discuss how best to address climate change, women were not always seen in most of these meetings. But with recent days, we are seeing like an increase in participation of like at least 36% of women participating in party delegations on issues around COP. We're also seeing women sit in decision-making tables like the UNFCCC. And this is an improvement, and this also means that women are taking up their spaces to address climate change in the world. In the local level also, we see women coming up with food diversification ideas. So like in Kenya, I recently attended the CGIR week, and one of those sessions, they were trying to discuss on how hybrid seeds that have been developed to address climate change are not very, very well adapted by communities in the local level. And one lady that stood out to speak on behalf of the local community came front and said that the community is well aware of how climate change is influencing their yields in the farms. And they have come up with their own local mechanisms of addressing those challenges. The issue is that when people make decisions in closed off doors and in decision making tables without involving them, and they come up with solutions without asking them whether it's going to support them, then that makes them feel alienated or isolated from the solution. And of course, if you do not want to associate me in a solution that is supposed to support me and help me, then I won't pay attention to that solution because I won't think it comes from a good point. So when the woman stood, she said openly that in the communities that she works with, they believe in saving their own seeds. They have their own seed banks. They know how to read their seasons. They know what to grow at what particular point. They can tell if rain has not come at this particular period and it's always raining, then they need to diversify the crops that they are going to farm. And that means even if there's climate change, there is also an alternative of them continuing to feed their household and continuing to make money. They're not dependent on the traditional crops they used to farm. They're trying to diversify and they're trying to integrate other new crops that they were not initially familiar with, but happen to be indigenous crops. And so this is also another level that shows how women are taking the front line in addressing issues on climate change, especially on food insecurity and hunger. Another way we see this is at the sub-national levels, women have come up in large numbers to set up their own cooperatives and to set up their own climate centers that are very well renowned. In the communities that I work with, the women that I work with were already in their own self-help groups, they were already in their own cooperatives, they just lacked resources to build their own resilience. And so what this means is they know how to group themselves, they know how to bring themselves together, and they know how to sit down and come up with solutions. And this shows you how prepared these women are in an event where a disaster strikes. Then they can meet together and say, now this has happened and this is how we can best address this situation. At the national level, we see women play very major roles in designing advocacy frameworks that address climate change. A good example would be in Kenya, we had our first Nobel Peace Prize winner, who was Wangari Maathai. And what she's known for is the Green Belt movement that championed for the growing of trees in Kenya to millions. And this is because she noticed that there was a lot of deforestation, and she came openly and spoke about the importance of tree cover, vegetation cover, and that led her to winning a Nobel Peace Prize. This is at a national level. This is a woman that was, before climate change happened, before deforestation happened, was never known. But when she realized that her community is being destroyed by the effects of deforestation, she came front and she decided to run a movement that was recognized globally. Another example is of the former Prime Minister of Barbados. Sorry, her name was Mia Mottley, and she was awarded by the UN champion of the East Africa Award, of the East Award, for her policy leadership on climate change and how that influenced some of the policies that were developed and they were integrated and they were implemented to address climate change. And finally, a very good example that I hold very, very dear is what was her name again? Her name was Jacinda Ardern. She was the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and during her tenure, she passed the Zero Carbon Bill in 2019, and she declared climate emergency in 2020. These actions that she did led to a follow-up implementation of policies that went ahead to protect her country against the brutal effects of carbon emission, and also decided to look deeply and invest on climate emergencies that people were not very keen to address at the time. And at the international level, we all know our activist and indigenous leader, Hido Omoru, who is coming from Ghana, and that has been recognized for the indigenous knowledge that she's spreading, and how she's using this indigenous level knowledge to champion for gendered perspectives in the COPs that are being held annually. And so these are women, and these are the efforts that they are putting to address climate change, from the local level to the national level to the regional level and also to the global level. And therefore, what this means is that despite establishing that climate change is not gender neutral, then we see how important it is to support these women that are taking frontline steps to protect and to look after their community and their countries with regards to the effects of climate change. You would ask, so then, are you trying to argue that we do not have gender responsive mechanisms that are addressing climate change and that are crucial for sustainable solutions? And this is what I'll tell you for one. It is important to know that you cannot address climate change with a one size fits all type of policy where you ignore vulnerable populations and you make solutions for them without thinking whether this is going to be sustainable or whether it's going to be just or whether they are going to address the specific challenges that are caused by climate change to specific genders. And by this, I mean, when you're making policies that are supposed to address climate change, then you should know that climate change influences different genders differently. And this brings me back to the same point again, by the way. Do you know what happens when there's climate change in a community that is largely affected by poverty? So then there'll be increase in the gender-based violence cases, that is for one. There'll be also increase in maternal health issues. I was once working in a community in Kenya, the coastal side of Kenya, and these communities it's actually an arid land. The community here also have very, very their customs and their culture is a little it does not favor our gender as women, and it puts women in more danger, because according to these customs, which I regard as retrogressive, women are not allowed to, of course, own land. Women are not allowed to education. women are not allowed in decision-making tables. And so when we were doing our project in this community, our project was around SRHR, by the way. So the one that was implementing this project thought that it is very important to distribute pads in a community of women because they cannot afford to buy pads. But they did not sit down to ask why these women cannot afford to buy these pads. Of course, what most NGOs do is they come up with short-term solutions for challenges that they see a community has, most often not involving these communities. And this ends up being a very bad strategy of addressing humanitarian crisis in these communities. And in this community, what I realized is in the process of us doing gender advocacy and SRHR and distributing sanitary towels, we were asking these women. I was holding interactive sessions and capacity building sessions with these women. And there's these constant questions that I kept asking different communities whenever we visit these different communities. I was like, exactly what would you want to be done differently for you to be able to get yourself to a position where you can actually buy your own protective gear with regards to SRHR? And they told us that the biggest challenge that they're experiencing is due to poverty, they can no longer feed their own family. Food is very, very expensive in this community. And what happens then is that these women are forced to marry off their children, their daughters. And most of them actually would rather give birth to daughters because giving birth to daughters, according to them, means that the daughters will eventually come and get married at some point, and the family that marries their daughter will be able to support the daughter's family. And by this, we probably mean maybe feed the family, maybe give them some, monetary support. And what was even more traumatizing is a mother sitting down and telling you the reason as why I married off my daughter is because I could not afford to buy cooking flour. So then she argued, why would you expect me to use my money to buy a sanitary pad when I cannot even afford to buy food? The same community is where this young 9-year-old will be married off to an old man that already has a few other women. And then in an event where there is drought, the man would want to relocate to an urban town to look for better alternatives to feed his family. And this woman is left alone. And when she's left alone, she's supposed to be in charge of the household. And since she's not the only wife in this household, then that means there is no priority to how she feeds her family or how the husband supports this particular family. And so this woman ends up also exposing herself to dangers with regards to sleeping with different men to be able to feed for herself and for her children that this husband left. And then now this community has a prevalence in HIV issues. Now, do you see how this cumulatively leads to other social challenges that were never there, but the initial problem was them not being able to feed themselves? And this is a community that used to experience stable rainfall. They used to grow their own crops. They used to feed their own families. But at this point, they can no longer do that. And so this is exactly how we are trying to see how best these gender responsive policies are supposed to be structured to be able to cater to these particular women in these particular communities. And when we talk about gender responsive policies, we're also looking at models that are designed to also allow women access to lands, allow women access to credits, allow women access to decision-making tables, allowing women to be able to openly advocate for change and champion for their own rights. When we're talking about gender-responsive policies, we are looking for policies that are funding women-led initiatives that are championing against climate change. We are looking at policies that are supporting women who are building climate resilience and climate mitigations in their own communities, right? So then when we talk about gender responsive policies, we are also looking at policies that do not only end at decision-making tables, but policies that extend to implementations, policies that have been passed and that have been integrated and that are being implemented in these particular communities and that are supposed to be gender responsive. climate change, again, is not gender neutral. It affects one gender more than it affects the other. And women in the room, when someone tries to pull you down and tell you that climate change affects all of us equally, because when there is drought, all of us experience drought, or when there is famine, all of us experience famine, or when there is floods, we all get to be displaced and rejoin refugee camps. No, you need to openly stand your foot and explain that it is not similar for everybody. That it is not similar because due to displacement of women, they cannot protect themselves when they don't have their male relatives around them. And therefore, they are more vulnerable and susceptible to rape. They are more vulnerable and susceptible to recruitment into extremist groups to be able to survive. And so when we are sitting in these decision-making tables and when we are championing for climate action, then we need to openly demand that we are given a priority to most of these solutions, because we are the ones who mostly come up with these solutions. We're the ones who mostly support our communities and our households. So we've been able to cover the effects of climate change on women, and we've been able to also explore how women are in the front line championing for climate change. The last time we had this discussion, we had attendees that were asking how then can they design a grassroots initiative that is supposed to support their communities against the branch effects of climate change. And so we are going to tackle that now. When I was designing Ekorafiki, allow me to talk about Ekorafiki a little bit more. So like I said earlier, Ekorafiki is a social enterprise organization. And what we do at Ekorafiki is very simple. I'll elaborate. So I always, immediately after my experience working with this community that had like interconnected social economic challenges caused by climate change, and after realizing that most of the solutions that most of the key decision makers and key stakeholders come up with to address are not very long-term related and are very short-term and will eventually not help these women, I decided to carve my own path and come up with a project and an initiative that would ideally help these particular women. In one of our roundtable discussions with these women, I asked them, in an event where you got someone that will support you and you sat down with them and they told you to tell them what exactly it is that you wanted, what would you ask them to do for you? And they told me simple, what they love and enjoy doing is growing their own crops. What they know how to do best is to grow their own crops. If anything, they do not even know how to do, they do not know how to trade anything besides agricultural products in the market. And so if asked what solutions they would want for themselves, she said, they collectively said that if they got support on how they can better build their agricultural sector and how they can get back into farming their own land, till their own land, grow their own crops, and support on getting these crops to the market and generate their own income, then that will be an immediate solution to their pending troubles, and they won't need any sanitary towel donations. And this is not to say that we don't need to donate sanitary towel. Please do not misquote me. It is very, very important that SRHR is also regarded with as much importance as anything else that is leading to humanitarian crisis from where we come from. What I'm only saying is based on my experience, this is what this community wanted, which is not similar to all communities, but based on the community that I worked with, this is what they wanted, and I actually resonated with them. And so when I was building Ekorafiki, this is what I had in mind. When I was settling with these communities, we realized that arid lands could no longer support the crops that they were growing earlier. And so we decided to come up with crops. We discussed with the community and they told us that the best crops that they would want to grow will be drought-resistant crops, those crops that can grow without necessarily needing a lot of water and taking care of. And so we set up Ekorafiki as an initiative that supports women in agriculture by providing them with drought-resistant tools, seeds, and materials and knowledge so that they can farm their own crops. In specific communities where we're implementing this project, after they farm these crops, we buy back the crops from them and we do value addition. And after doing value addition, we come up with products like porridge blends that we distribute in communities that are experiencing extreme hunger. And now this builds a circular model where these particular women in a community grow crops that feed kids in a community that cannot afford to feed themselves, where there is high malnutrition issues, where there is high hunger indexes and high poverty rates. And so that is the model that we work around with Ecorafiki. This is an introduction to how best then can you design your own model. And if we were keen, what you will gather out of it is that we did not just wake up and decide, no, we are going to do drought resistant farming in this particular community. What we did is we decided to sit down with this community. We decided to integrate them. We decided to work with them. We decided to work with them. We were not basing our design on assumptions. We knew that the community we are working with and the women that already there already had their own lived experiences, and that they already held their own knowledge on the food systems and the water access problems that they had. And so what we started with, and now this is an answer to how to design, is one, we started by conducting a community dialogue session. And this led to a follow-up of many more dialogue sessions. Once we conducted these dialogues, we mapped out the prevalent daily climate stresses in these particular communities. In our case, at Ecorafiki, this was hunger. In our case, this was crop failure. In our case, this was economic lack of economic empowerment. So once we mapped out these prevalent stresses, then we decided to understand their existing coping mechanisms. So of course, yes, there is hunger. Of course, yes, there is crop failure. Of course, yes, you cannot generate your own income. So then what coping mechanisms are you currently having? And what are you trying to do to support yourself and your household and your communities at large? So they gave a few examples, and there were these informal jobs that they would maybe talk about. So in their community, there are these extension services, and there are these organizations that were coming and securing large tracts of land, and they grow crops. So what these women will do is to offer services by probably farming for these particular organizations, harvest their crops, package their crops. That was their coping mechanism, right? So once we established that that is how they were doing and that is how they were trying to address their challenges, we went ahead to now focus on their problem and not their solution. When you're designing a project that is supposed to help a community, often at times, we're always focusing on a solution. You're always hell-bent on it has to end up like this, it has to look like this. You know, I have a friend who was trying to get into this climate change sector, and it is because she was very passionate and she really wanted to support and address climate change at her own particular level. So when we were having discussions and when she was building her own model, you will realize she was very hell-bent on a solution that was already in her head. So for example, there was this time she came and she discussed with me, and she decided that what she was ready to do is she wanted to address climate change with by addressing the climate education angle. And so she argued that most children in schools don't understand what climate change is, and it is very important that they are aware of what climate change is. So then I asked her, so what do you intend to do now that you've established that this is a problem? And she outrightly said that her focus is to build VR materials for schools so that kids can get an opportunity to have an interactive session and to immerse themselves in the effects of climate change. And she argued that it is very important that this is a VR material generated content. So then that means her solution will be limited to only schools that could afford those machines, to schools that had access to computers. What happens to schools that are in rural communities that don't even have desks, that don't even have tables, that don't even feed their kids, but are the ones that are affected the most? The very schools that cannot afford food, the very schools where kids have to walk kilometers to go and study. How then can you be addressing climate change and isolate this particular school? Well, her argument was very, very relative. It was very, very important. But the challenge here was that her focus was not, she did not want to focus specifically to schools that were able. She wanted to incorporate all schools. She wanted to be able to cater to a model in the rural area and a model in the urban area. But then again, this ended up being an epic fail because there is no way she was going. She went ahead and developed materials and content for the VR project, but then she could not implement this in these particular schools that she was focused on implementing. And so when she was doing her impact analysis, she realized that what she was doing was to offer a solution to a community, or rather to a school that had access to knowledge and had access to materials and understanding of climate change. And she did not offer this particular solution as well to a community that lacked these advantages. And so what this tells you is that often at times, if you focus on a solution rather than focusing on the problem itself, you will end up having a project that looks very beautiful on paper, but very difficult to implement. And that is a problem. You start designing a model that is supposed to help people, and you start by focusing on their particular problem. This particular problem will help you carve a way out and come up with a solution. Another way where you can design a project that is supposed to help a community and climate change is make sure that you co-design the solution also with the community. What this means is sit down with this community and generate ideas, a lot of ideas together. Sit down with them and ask them, so what do you think would ideally work? They're going to front so many ideas, they're going to give you so many options. And most of these are limited to their own lived experiences and exposure. So what you do here is, as you sit down and as they help you ideate, you come up with your own backed up knowledge, you come up with your own research. And when you combine this, then what happens is that after you ideate this, then you will end up holding a lot of brainstorming sessions. So you sit down with this community, and now they've given you 10 ideas, they've given you 20 ideas, and now you want them to settle down with specific 2 ideas that will be perfect for them. And so you brainstorm with them, and you sit down and you ask them, and you tell them, this will ideally probably not make, because Mr. This said that we cannot implement this because the local government cannot allow this, Once you have these brainstorming sessions and you settle down with a few solutions that you think will be ideal, then you go ahead to do a resource mapping process with this community. And by this we mean, say for example, in an event where we're doing in Korafiki, we are designing projects around drought resistant farming and regenerative agriculture. So when we sat down with this community, we went through this process and then we got to resource mapping. And when we were discussing, the women told us that it is equally very important for us to have a small pilot farm where we can demonstrate, we can bring in a trainer, and that trainer or agronomist will help us and they will guide us on how to farm, tell us how to farm these drought resistant crops. When do we need to water them? When do we need to weed them? When do we need to harvest them? How can we protect them from birds and stuff like that? So once they told us we needed a pilot farm, then we told them, then our challenge is we cannot afford to buy a pilot farm. So what can we do? And they gave us access to community assets that they already had. They told us that there is this piece of land that you can use as your demo farm to train us on how to grow these crops. And an advantage to that is the land will not entirely be free, because you'll be growing crops. Once this crop germinate and they grow and it's time to harvest, we will distribute this food amongst ourselves and the surplus will be sold. So you see, they come up with their own solutions, and they even offer you community assets that you can work with that they already have. So at the back of your mind, maybe you are budgeting, you're like, oh no, I'll need to lease land at 30,000, or maybe I'll need to lease generator to pump water. Maybe I'll need to secure humans, I'll probably need to hire a security guard to, guard the farm so that we don't have anybody stealing our produces. That is probably what you had, and that is what you had to budget for. But when you sit down with these communities, then they come back and they tell you some of the solutions that they're willing to offer on them for themselves, because they know that this project is going to help them. And so once you map out the resources that are available, then you go back to prototyping. And so in front of people, you now start getting honest opinion. You've decided to do what you've decided to farm sorghum. In Ekorafiki, that is what we're doing. We're currently focusing on sorghum, millet, any drought resistant crop that will work perfectly well in dry lands of Laikipia County, Rumuruti. And right now we're focusing on sorghum. So the sorghum was supposed to be grown. This is the amount of harvest we're supposed to come out with, and then this is what we're supposed to develop in terms of like a prototype for the porridge blend. So what we do is we went ahead and we outsourced the sorghum because we were not able to like harvest at that particular time of prototyping. We outsourced sorghum, and then we generated our first prototype, the most minimum viable product that we could make. And then this prototype we distributed amongst households in this particular community. And we asked them to feed their kids and to get their opinion. How is the taste? Is it palatable? How is the texture? Do you think it fills the stomach of your kid? Are there any products that you think may be allergic to most kids in this community? Do you think they consume sorghum very well? Is it acceptable for them? Is there a culture issue around this particular product? So once we had a prototype and we distributed and we got our honest feedback, then we came back and we worked with the community again to determine who will manage the solutions that we've come up with. And we also sat down with them and we decided on how these decisions will be made moving forward and what resources will be used and how then can we make this sustainable. So far, that is how you can design a project, right? But then you do not have to end there. Most communities, it is hard for you to get a success rate of initiatives that do not integrate economic empowerment. In most of these communities, poverty is a big challenge. In most humanitarian issues, when you're trying to build an initiative around humanitarian crisis, poverty is a very big challenge. And so even if you're asking women to farm with you, they'll ask you, so then how do we benefit out of this? Can we make money out of it? Can we feed our own households with this? And so you also need to integrate, when you're building your initiative, you also need to integrate economic empowerment. Make sure there's a model where these people can equally just survive when you are no longer supporting them. When the project maybe can no longer continue in this community, make sure that by the time you're leaving, this particular community can still thrive on their own. And that is where you integrate what? Economic empowerment. Something else is that it is important for you to make your project very, very practical and very, very replicable. Don't make a project that is very, very hard to understand. Don't come up with a model that you yourself does not even know what it means. Make it very simple, very practical, very relatable to that particular community. Because what this means is, if they meet these standards of practicality, relatability, then that means that it is easy to scale this particular project. Something else that is also important when you're designing your project is that you need to integrate awareness with actions. At times, this community don't even know that specific problems are problems. They don't realize that these are problems. And so it is important that you also integrate awareness sessions. And by this, we are talking about training sessions, round tables, community baraza, sit down with them, talk to them. If you're talking about drought-resistant farming, they know that growing sorghum is good because sorghum will grow. But train them and help them understand how sorghum is a drought-resistant crop and what type of sorghum will work where and how long will this sorghum take to grow. So then this, by you creating awareness and you integrating it in action, then that means that the success rate of this initiative will be higher compared to someone that just integrates a project but does not combine it to awareness. And then finally, when we were building a Korafiki, there was so much that I used to tell myself. I was very scared because I was asking myself, so then how can I do this? I have never developed a prototype. I'm not even a nutritionist. How can I come up with a porridge blend that will work for school going kids between the age of 3 and 12? How will I know which product is not good, which product is good? And so out of this overwhelm, someone sat me down and told me you don't have to have all of these solutions. It is important to partner and collaborate with people. Look for organizations that are already doing something that you want to work on that you cannot do on your own. If you're setting up a water conservation project, look for communities that are already distributing water in these communities. If you want to set up, how do you call this? If you want to set up, the solar systems, if you want to set up solar systems in communities where there is a lot of sunlight, but they don't have water, how can you then partner with organizations that are already distributing water in these particular communities? You need to learn how to collaborate with people. You need to know how to partner with people. You need to, and by the way, that reminds me, when you're designing your project also, there's a very important thing that you need to also factor in. How then can you also draw out your key stakeholders for this initiative who are very important for you in this initiative? In this community, you'll need to work with the local government. In this community, there are already existing NGOs you'll need to partner with. In this community, we have schools, we have churches. Map out your key stakeholders. Once you map out your key stakeholders, then go ahead to build collaborations and partnerships with people. If you don't have money, have people that have money help you build these initiatives. If you don't have resources, have them give you resources, because it is a win-win for the both of you. Finally, make sure you build a model that outlives the project. And this is what we call sustainability. Make sure that this project does not end with this particular community. Let the community there embrace the project. Let them take it as their own. Let it outlive the model that you had introduced. That way, what that means is that this particular community can also come up with better sustainable solutions that can help improve the project further. Until there, yes, we've already covered how to build a model. I'm going to take the few questions that have been posed, answer them. I don't know whether we still have time. I know I have exhausted my time. I'm so sorry, Tamina. I'm just going to answer these questions very fast. I'm sorry, questions that I do not have an answer to. I don't, but I'm hoping if you host me again, I come up with answers next time. So, what leadership qualities should women develop today to take on stronger climate action roles by 2030? I feel like the most important leadership skill that a woman needs to have is courage. You need to be very courageous. You need to be very courageous because the stakes are not even for everybody. You need to be very courageous. You need to also know how to do your research. You need to be very informed, be very knowledgeable. Often at times we assume we know everything, but we don't. What works for you may not work for other people. For you to have great leadership skills, you need to know how to collect and gather knowledge that is supposed to help you and build you and your career. You also need to know how to strategically communicate yourselves in an event where you're invited in these decision-making tables. It is different for you to be eloquent and know how to talk. And it is also different when you know how to talk and when you know how to be eloquent and you combine your thoughts in a way that can be interpreted and understood. So you need to be a very good strategic communicator. Another skill that I think is very important, another quality, I'm just going to give one last one because there's so many. One last quality that you need to have is it is important to know where we started off on this journey as women in the climate space. How would I explain this better? Do you see, for example, conversations on feminists, how a woman will just outrightly one day wake up and say, I'm a feminist, and they don't even know what feminism is? and then they come up with ideas on feminism that are very radical and equally toxic. This is because some of these people do not take their time to understand the genesis and the history that builds the foundation that women have with regards to what feminism is. And so when you want to build a strong leadership quality, to be able to take on stronger climate action roles, well, familiarize yourself with the history of women in the space of climate change. That will give you courage that we talked about, that will give you knowledge, that will give you understanding, and that will remind you that you're not alone in this journey. So many of us are behind you. The next question, in your experience, what are the key gender gaps in climate policy and community response that need urgent attention? I have talked about this. I think this question came before we talked about it, but I'll give one specific gender gap that I think is missing in climate policy. Like I said, climate change is not gender neutral. It's not same for both genders. And so when most I was doing my research actually. I was doing my research, and there's this policy by the UN. Allow me to take a look. I hope I find it in my notes. Was it the Sengai policy? Sengai policy. It's a very good policy on climate change and gender mainstreaming on climate change. But when they were doing the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, I'm going to paste it in the comment section. So in case you want to read about it, please go and do it. And this was adopted by the UN General Assembly, and the framework was to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks. And this framework, its primary responsibility was to reduce disasters, and they built it by integrating gender responsive actions to it. But one of the biggest gaps that this policy had was the fact that they lacked a clear implementation structure for it. And so that is an example of a policy that has a gap. It is okay for you to have a policy that we know is gender responsive, but then do you have a plan on how you can, do you have a plan on how you can implement it to a level that will address the same communities? The next question is, what is one simple step women can take if they want to start a climate project in their area? I already told you, like, the model that I gave you is the simplest, trust me. You do not have to beat your head too hard coming up with a solution or read and research so much. Start by going to those communities, ask them about the challenges that they're experiencing, the problems that they have. Those same communities will help you build those solutions. They will be the ones to build it. Do you know what that makes you? An implementer of those solutions. What that makes you is someone that safeguards these solutions. So you have the ideas from the community. They are going to work with you in implementing it. The only thing that you need to do is to safeguard this project and this initiative so that it can maintain its it can continue being a success, and it can outlive itself. So I already talked about that, how you can build the steps that you can take to start a climate project. You can listen in if you missed that bit, but since there's a recording, you can go back and listen to it. The next question, what simple actionable climate projects can women start in their communities with no funding? It's so simple. There's a lot. You can start up a cleanup project. You can decide to set up a climate education project in schools. And by this, I don't need, it doesn't mean that you need to be an expert on climate change. You have your own knowledge. You have friends and you have acquaintances that are knowledgeable on climate change. So what you do is just organize sessions in schools. I'll tell you something. I've posted about this before. I have led a lot of climate conversations, and I was focusing on two models most part of last year. The first model was on holding capacity building sessions in informal settlements in Kenya, and where we try to educate the communities on food security, food systems, and climate change. And then the other model that is also climate education related was in schools, where we try to integrate gamified sessions to kids to be able to understand climate change. That is a very simple model. I did not need any money. Of course, the only money that I used was transport for me and my team, and maybe refreshment. But that was just it. You work with a community leader, help them mobilize people, sit down and tell them, you're going to have a session and we're going to teach you on water management, on cleanup, importance of cleanup sessions, on waste management. Organize these things. They do not require any money. Another one, you can decide to grow trees. It is very simple. There are so many ideas that you can start in your own communities without funding. But before you start these ideas, sit down with these particular communities and understand what exactly it is that is their challenge. If I give you ideas right now, I can tell you to go and implement an idea on waste management, but the community you're working with, the problem is that they don't have access to water. So it won't help. Start by sitting down with this community, help them understand what their challenge is, try to understand their coping mechanism as at now, and then build a model that can work for them. And when you're building this model, you realize that there's a way you can simplify this model without necessarily needing funding. And also, in an event where there is no funding, it is also important that you also put yourself out there and join accelerator programs. There's so many, there are programs that are taking on students that have idea stage models to their project. They have never implemented anything. They don't have a prototype. They don't have an MVP. It is not scalable yet. They just have an idea in their head. Join these accelerator projects. And besides joining these accelerator projects, sit down with the communities, understand what their challenges are, and build their and build better models. The next question is, can you share one success story from your project that shows how women can make a big impact? Oh my goodness, there's just a lot. So there's this one community that I work with, and it's in the informal settlement, a place called Korokocho in Kenya. It's very, very informal, by the way. Life there is just, the way you will define informal settlement, there's high health issues associated with cholera, diarrhea, malaria. There's a lot of insecurity, there's a lot of unemployment, there's a lot of crime. I worked with this community, and we were talking, and most of these women that we were sitting down with were food vendors. So one of the biggest challenges that they had was, there was this time we experienced like very, very heavy flooding in Kenya, and Nairobi was affected largely. And these informal settlements were affected the most, because what is even interesting is that the communities I was working with was living in an area, in a land that was considered, how do you call these lands that are, these houses that are, I know this term. Well, what they did was they were building businesses and they were building houses in regions that, or rather, they were building in places that was not allowed to be built because there was a river that was going through that particular region. I know this term, I've forgotten this term. But then what happened is, after the flooding, the government decided to demolish all of the shops and all of the houses that were built in this particular region. And then they promised that they are going to compensate this family so that they can be able to like rebuild their houses somewhere else. But unfortunately, due to corruption, which is very huge and rampant in most countries, money went to the wrong hands. And so these women that were relying on this as their source of income, as their homes, most of them ended up moving in with family, or probably relocating to the rural areas where there is no potential for income, or so they think, by the way, or so they think, because I don't think that is true. And so when we were sitting down with them, and they were very emotional and they were very angry at the same time, and we asked them, okay, fine, this is a problem that we've already said, established that exists. So then how best do you think you can, what do you think you can do that will help you and your community more to address this situation? Due to corruption, they said that this land cannot be constructed on because it is I keep trying to remember that name, and I'm sure it won't come right now. It will probably come after the session, maybe like 2 hours later when I'm eating. But anyway, due to corruption, they said you cannot construct, so they demolished these lands. But then they gave out the contract to another company to set up a green space. But instead of them setting up a green space, the women realized that there were some activities around construction that were taking place in that particular region, in that particular area. And so they gathered together and they came together and we sat down with them and they told us the issue. And once we discussed, they collectively wrote a petition to the county government and they said that we cannot allow this company to continue doing this because this land has already been set out to be land that cannot be constructed on. And so this was one of the success stories that I've had to experience. And that particular contractor had to leave. The project on green spaces is still underway, but hopefully that nothing similar will happen in the near future. And also there's this company that has been polluting the environment because they've been banning plastic. They also came together and they sat down and they said we cannot allow this to happen anymore. And so that was also a success story. How do we measure the success and impact of small-scale climate initiatives? How many people what was the challenge first? And then once you set up a challenge, if the issue was hunger, what were the margins of hunger in this particular community? Were they going hungry because they could only afford one meal a day? So at the end of your initiative, how many meals can they afford? At the end of the initiative, how many children have dropped out of school because they cannot afford food? And now the end of your initiative, how many have stayed in school and have progressed their education? There's just so many ways you can measure the impact and the success of your small scale climate initiative, especially when you set your own KPIs before starting your own initiative. What do you want to see at the end of this project? If it's waste management, we want to reduce waste by 20%. We don't want people to use single-use plastics. So the impact is we are trying to have them use maybe reusable materials instead of single-use plastic. So then this is an impact, and this is how you can measure it. How can women entrepreneurs integrate sustainability into their businesses? Sorry, I can't see that question. Or start green ventures. By sustainability, we mean that this project has to be running on its own for a long duration of time, and it should be able to support both human, the environment, and the person that is doing it economically. So how then, your question is how can you integrate sustainability into these businesses? Is by thinking long term about this business. It should not end at the end of the day, what I want is money. No. If your project is on green ventures, what you want to achieve will help you set up your own sustainability model. Most people are not able to go beyond achieve sustainability because they focus more on the economic support that they get out of it. How much money can I make out of it? And they end up neglecting other issues. Like at the end of it, is it sustainable? It is not, because why we are ruining the environment. I'm cutting down trees. So say for example you want to set up a business in for example clean energy, and you realize that one of the ways you can make clean energy materials is by using coconut husks. And so that means people have to eat more coconuts to be able to get more coconut husks. But in an event where you're building this model, if you are not sustainable, what you will think is a place where existed natural habitats, or like there was biodiversity, you end up cutting these trees and replacing them with trees that grow coconut alone. And of course, to some degree, you'll lose biodiversity. So you'll be focusing more on growing more coconuts so that you get coconut husks and make clean energy. And at this point, you've already ruined nature, you've ruined the environment. So you need to build a model that attends to both the nature, it attends to both the human and that particular environment, and also attends to you and your own economic abilities based on that business. So that is how you ensure that it is sustainable. Integrate all three. What role can mentorship play in helping young climate leaders grow and sustain their initiatives? Look, when we're talking about mentorship, what is actually very interesting is I feel like mentorship right now when we're talking about mentorship, we need to also integrate intergenerational mentorship, because there's difference between mentorship and there's difference between intergenerational mentorship. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge that communities that existed long before we were born, they still carry. And so when you talk about what role this mentorship can help in can play in helping these young climate leaders, ask yourself what mentorship models can be built first. Because mentorship, wait first, am I even understanding this question? What role can a mentorship play in helping young climate leaders grow and sustain their initiatives? Well, that is a very good question and it's very elaborate. You probably don't know how to build your initiative. You probably know you don't know how to scale your initiative. So maybe mentorship with someone that has already been there is a very good strategy. But what I'm also advocating for is if you're considering going the direction where you want to provide mentorship to be able to help young climate leaders, also try to integrate intergenerational mentorship. That is what people are not doing so often right now. Most people are relying on materials that are in the internet, they're relying on technology, IT, and they're forgetting indigenous knowledge that we had and we survived on long before these technologies came about. So when you're talking about mentorship role, a lot can mentorship will help people to understand the problems that they're trying to address better. It will help them build their own solutions better. It will help them to be more self-aware and stuff like that. But also when you're building this mentorship program, try to integrate intergenerational mentorship in it. Yes, I think I've answered all the questions. There was question 4 supposed to address, but I don't think we have time. I don't know what Tafmina thinks. There's this one last question with what I was supposed to present on. Let me read it. And it was on
Miss
introducing practical. Sorry.
Miss Missile,
Yes.
can you hear? Thank you so much, Miss Missile, for this insightful presentation. But we think we have crossed the time, like 20 minutes more.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I was taken away.
No worries. No worries at all, Miss Missile. We enjoy it, and like if they let us, we will give you 2 hours. But the problem is that after this session, we will have another session soon, so we need to make up everything and be ready for the next session.
Yes.
That's why I think we are good to go. And thank you so much for sharing your insightful points. I truly agree with everything you highlighted, especially the importance of understanding the road cases of conflict and involving communities in the solution process. Like I would like to add that when we focus on open communication, active listening, and early intervention, we can prevent many conflict from growing and becoming more serious. Like, it is also important that we encourage people to work together, respect each other's like perspective, and build trust within their community. By promoting cooperation and awareness, we can create a more peaceful and supportive environment for everyone. This is so true. And we really, really enjoyed the session with you, Miss Meso. And thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining. Let us all continue taking small and big actions to protect our environment and support our communities. This brings our session to the close. Thank you so much, Miss Meso. Thank you so much, everyone. And have a wonderful day. Bye bye. Miss Meso, if you have anything to say, we are all here to listen.
No, thank you so much for having me. I had a very good time exchanging notes, or rather, offering my views. Thank you so much again for having me. I can't wait to
So,
attend the next sessions as well and learn from other leaders and mentors. Thank you.
for sure, Miss Miro. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Please have a rest. Thank you, everyone. Have a rest. See you soon.